About to leave, already packed. About to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's go. Let's be free with me. Be free. Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free.
Hello, good evening. It's great to see lots of you joining us live this evening, and I'm sure there'll be many others also watching us on catch up. I'm joined this evening by Ciara. Hi, Ciara. How are you doing?
Good, how are you?
I'm all right, thanks. Yeah, looking forward to this. We're already getting lots of comments in the live chat window, which is great to see. And so I thought I'd explain a little bit what we're doing tonight and pick up on some of the points that people are raising. So the idea with tonight's session was we haven't done anything on core political ideas for a while. We have done them in the past, and you can go through some of our past live streams to find more on the core political ideas if you like. So we want to do a bit of that. We're going to do some live revision on that, but also it's our last meeting before paper one. Last time we'll see you before paper one. And we like to try and do a bit of a kind of a warm up. Now it's still 6 days, nearly a week till your exam. So this isn't like kind of the final pep talk. It's not your not your pep talk for like when sometimes we've done it the day before or whatever. But it is a good opportunity to have a think about paper one. Any questions you've got about it, any concerns you've got, anything you'd like us to go over briefly and have a chat with you about, any questions you've got, specific questions. And some of that's already coming in. It's quite broad at the moment, some of the questions. I've just had a question, is this only ideologies? No. So in terms of any kind of question and answer activities. We've got some on ideologies, but we're happy to talk to you about anything paper one in the next 45 minutes or so. So I'm getting lots of things for UK politics type topics, which is fine, and we'll come back to those in a moment. So I'll tell you what, I'm gonna pick up a few of these points and I'm gonna get them on the screen for us just to have a little look. So the first of these is an ideas one, and we're going to be talking about ideas quite a bit. Since socialism and liberalism came up last year, is conservatism more likely this year? Now, I think the first thing we'd say is that we're never in the business of predictions. We don't know what's on the paper. I think it's always, personally, I think it's always a risk to try and sort of predict, because we don't know anything that's listed on the spec could be asked for any tariff of question, and therefore it could well be a conservatism question. It's not guaranteed though, so I think we'd agree with that, Ciara. There's no could be any combination of the choice of questions.
Yeah, and I think that's important because you can actually sometimes get two questions on the same ideology, just a different factor in the ideology. So
it's theoretically possible, isn't it? Yeah.
It's theoretically possible. So I think it's just good to cover your basis and make sure you've got quite a sound understanding in all three ideologies. It's just safer in that sense.
That is the safe.
But I'm not much of a gambler, so
no, stick or twist. No, so I mean, what's written there is true, and so you can take from that what you will. But it's it very much could be anything. But we'll have a look at some conservatism maybe in a minute, just to respond to that. I'm just going to briefly bring up some of the things that have been added to. People have said voting behaviour in recent local elections. Absolutely, we could talk about that. Wow, lots here. Media, think tanks, lobbying, and corporations, please. And can we go through referendums, please? So there's a lot there, and I'm sure there's more coming through. I'm seeing more coming. I'm favouriting things that that people I've got a number of questions here, so we'll do it. I'll tell you what, just so I can go through some of this, let's have a little look at some conservatism questions. You can have a little go with those, and I'll keep checking which of your comments we can perhaps come and have a look at afterwards. So let's go to the questions. And Ciara, do you want to talk us through this one?
Yeah, of course. So it's obviously good to keep those questions coming so we can basically sort them out and answer them throughout the session. But it's also good to kind of think about our ideologies. And for the next couple of activities, it's actually about thinking about the thinkers and where they match into the strands. And it's good to kind of categorize those things and also think about how they connect to them too. So you're going to have 60 seconds. Can you match these thinkers to these strands? And just write your answers in the comments.
Answers coming quickly in.
Ready, right? There. Excellent answer. Probably point for investing.
Right, I'm gonna, before we go through them, there's a nice comment from Jessie which I just want to pick up on because it's a good point. I thought thinkers didn't have specific strands they're a part of, but rather you refer to them when it's relevant, and I think that is a really good point. Some of the thinkers fit nicely into a strand, and some of them are not just in conservatism, across all the ideas, including your non-core ones as well. Some of them are nicely exemplifying a strand, There's no doubt Burke was a traditional conservative, for example,
Mm.
or Nozick was new right, but there are thinkers that you know you can use to make more than points from potentially across more than one strand, and some that maybe are more about you know don't quite fit neatly into any of the strands, but you could use them to help make a point. Oakshot's probably quite a good example of that, isn't it? Of one that maybe uh, you know quite how he described himself might be different from how we've put him here potentially. Would you
Yeah, and
agree?
exactly. And I think it can, because obviously it's quite important that you address all the strands in your answers. So it can be quite helpful to think about where you could fit those thinkers. And yeah, you're right. It doesn't perfectly fit. I don't think, Burke had a badge that said traditional conservative. He would have just kind of called himself a conservative. So yeah, you're completely right. But it can help with revision and structuring ideas and structuring answers as well to make sure you kind of address all of them. And yeah, excellent. I could see that, the answers in the chat were brilliant. Your revision's obviously going really well. So you're traditional, you've got Hobbes and Burke. So more so arguing about things like noblesse oblige that we saw from Edmund Burke, and Hobbes about his kind of traditional role of the state with the unquestionable monarch, and quite, again, pessimistic views of human nature, which transcends across all of them. And then One Nation is Oakeshott. I saw somebody kind of wanting a bit of clarification on One Nation conservatism. And what that effectively is with One Nation is the phrase comes from a time when England was seeming to be split into two nations, in the sense that you had really rich people and really poor people. And it was about trying to heal those
Mm.
divides in society, and that kind of almost paternalistic role of
Yeah.
the wealthy to support the people lower down, and hopefully preventing a revolution and the splitting of the country.
Yeah, it's
uh,
interesting, isn't it? Because they're,
yeah.
and I think this is where we can see links between the different strands, can't we? Because it very much echoes some of the traditional conservative points, that noblesse oblige, paternalism, um, but there's perhaps more of a focus on the government helping the lower orders, in inverted commas,
Mm.
as they would have been thought of in the 19th century. And yeah, the name comes from Disraeli wrote a book called The Two Nations, which was the rich and the poor, and this fear that
Mhm.
that England had become two nations who were pulling in different directions or whatever, and you know there was lots of still, obviously Burke was writing about French Revolution, but even through the 19th century, there were still lots of revolutions and rifts in continental Europe, and this idea that maybe we could avoid the UK having a similar fate if we could
Mm.
somehow bring the nation together. So a lot of it was the rich helping the poor and the government helping the poor, but it was also, I think someone said in the chat window, I'm not sure it was, sort of bringing the nation together through various things as well, so kind of patriotism and things as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Lots of people were
Jakob.
asking about noblesse
Yeah.
oblige. Yeah, which is kind of the idea that the rich have a responsibility, obligation to
Mm.
look after those less fortunate themselves. Probably Burke, who we'd probably most
Yeah.
associate it with, but it then went on to influence the One Nation conservatives
And
as
it's
well. But
that idea of an organic society, in the sense that, society is a body almost, and made up of different components. So the elites, the kind of aristocracy, the natural aristocracy, their role is the head. They lead, and they instruct the other parts of the body. So all parts are important. There's just different roles, and obviously different rewards, which he doesn't go into too much, I guess. But
um,
so Jakob's question was quite good. Yes, good. Yeah. About using key thinkers in your essay without basing your essays around the thinkers, basing your essays around the thinkers rather than the ideology. And I think that is a valid feedback. Actually, you don't want to just be doing an essay where you're rattling off key
no,
thinkers, and
so
in the
thinks
same
this,
way
so
that
so
you would,
thinks that. Mm,
yeah,
yeah,
and you wouldn't write a 30-mark question just listing examples. It's the same principle.
yeah,
Yeah, the purpose of the ideologies essays is that you're exploring how an ideology has changed and the extent to which it's changed over time, and your thinkers are just like your examples. You're using them to exemplify the thoughts on the ideology, kind of the strands, and how those have adapted over time.
Yeah. So if you think about your points as being the extent to which the strands agree, which, as Ciara says, is usually change over time. Obviously, some of the strands coexist. They both exist at the same time, so it's debates within the ideology as well. But although not many examples of that when I think of it, I always think that's the case. Possibly socialism would be the clearest one, where sometimes it's coexisting strands arguing with each other. But yeah, if you think the points are to what extent the strands agree, your examples to illustrate whether they agree or not come from your thinkers. Yeah, so that's probably the best way to think about that dilemma.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
and Finlay asked, "Can you do both? Can they do both questions on one ideology?" Yes, that
Yeah.
can happen. Yeah,
Yeah.
so they could
Yeah.
ask two conservatism questions and things like that. I'd hope not, but
Yeah.
they're well within their rights to do that.
Yeah. I think I'm right in saying they never have
Mm.
as yet, unless it was on
I think it's been on a sample
a
assessment
sample
before
paper.
or
Yeah.
something. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I've just unfavorited one I wanted to favourite anyway. Uh, but yes, it could. Yeah, someone else has put. Yeah, there was a sample paper. It did. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's right. Um, people are answering full essay questions on here, which is always nice. For
Yes.
example, got on here like the new right do not agree with fraternalism, believing in atomism, and that meritocratic states should succeed based on their own merit. I don't know. Someone must have must have
The
started
debate
there.
in the chat is good, yeah, and it's good to
Yeah.
see you guys thinking in that way and putting it within a criteria as well, which is excellent.
How do you structure a socialism or a conservatism essay to make sure you'd fully compared all the strands? That's a really good question, because obviously with liberalism you can essentially just do it modern liberalism versus classical liberalism and
Yeah.
have that nice little debate between the two. And as soon as you have three or more strands, that becomes more difficult. And I would say try and get all the strands into your answer, not necessarily into every point, but in the essay, across the essay, I would try and make sure you've talked about all the strands. By the strands, I mean the ones that are named specifically on the spec. So if you're doing socialism, do try and get social democracy in there, not just revolutionary versus third way, for example. Yeah, that's one of the ones that sometimes gets missed out. Or try and make sure you've got one nation in there in your conservatism essay, that you don't just do a traditional versus new right. Even though sometimes you'll just be saying that they largely agree. You might be saying,
Mm.
yeah, third way and social democrats largely agree that something about capitalism or whatever, and that's fine. That's whereas revolutionary socialists strongly disagree, and that would then be your kind of debate. But yeah, your sort of structure then isn't necessarily strand versus strand; it's agreement versus disagreement, isn't it? I think
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
probably that's probably the thing to think about. You know, here's where they agree versus here's where they disagree.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's just staying focused on the question, identifying the factor that's in the question. So whether it's talking about the state, if it's talking about a core principle and things like that, and just thinking about, well, what areas can you compare within that so that you can mention the strands and how far they agree or disagree on that aspect of it. And that's essentially what you're always coming back to.
What's the issue with using evolutionary socialism if the spec seems to not accept it? Is it democratic socialist and social democrat instead? To be honest, democratic socialist isn't in the spec either, which is problematic, and there's no getting over that it's problematic. It's, I think it's partly down to when the spec was written, that they kind of neglected perhaps an important strand in socialist thinking. And of course, Beatrice Webb is difficult to use if you're not talking about evolutionary socialism or democratic socialism.
Yeah.
What I would say is it's not that you can't show that you know about this and that you're aware that some socialists aren't revolutionary, but they're not social democrats either. You can demonstrate that you're aware of that. Some people want to get rid of capitalism, but by democratic means. But just be cautious that you don't forget that isn't one of the strands, that your main debate is between those three strands that are named on the spec. Okay.
And I can see people are asking, do we use web then and things like that,
Yeah.
and why isn't it on the spec? And they're just some
Yeah.
things that are just odd
Yeah.
about the spec.
Web is on the
And I
spec, and you can use it to illustrate lots of points, problems with revolution, reasons why
exactly,
capitalism's bad. You can use it in lots of ways. Um, but the actual strand of democratic socialism isn't officially named on the spec.
yeah, and that's the thing. You're kind of doing two things. Well, you're doing a lot of things in this in your essays, but kind of the things that you can get capped on in the question would be not using at least two key thinkers that are named, and not comparing the three strands of socialism
Yeah,
that they've defined. So revolutionary, social democracy, and third way. So it's just
yeah,
about effectively making sure you've covered those
yeah,
bases. So as
yeah,
interesting as it would be to write
mm,
loads about evolutionary socialism or democratic
mm,
socialism,
yeah,
it wouldn't go towards fitting those
no,
criteria. And just remember, you know a lot, and this is just your moment where
yeah,
you're trying to address what the
yeah,
exam is wanting you to
yeah.
do. So,
And precisely what the question's asking, and the question will be asking you about those strands. Similarly, um, sorry, I'm sorry for getting loads of seeing comments. I'm trying to put them. Is social democracy that different to evolutionary socialism? That's a really good question. Probably not one for today because we don't even need to talk about evolutionary socialism that much. But there is a distinction. But how do you include other strands if the question focuses on one strand agreeing or disagreeing over something? That's an interesting one because there was a question I think last time about. Or I have seen a question on the new right. I think where it was specifically said. Actually, I think it was the third way. It was last time. It was the third way. To what extent as they agree with main socialist principles or something like that,
yeah.
rather than to what extent do different socialists agree about something specific. It was like the questions only mentioned the third way, but you would still end up talking about all the strands. So it'd be like, well, the third way
Mm.
differs from tradition from revolutionary socialism because of this that, but it agrees with it on this, and it agrees with social democracy on that. So you would still talk about it. Okay. I mean, I don't want to get too distracted on the evolutionary socialism thing because it's not on the spec, but or not specifically as a named strand, but the social democracy as we use it doesn't mean that you'd get rid of capitalism, whereas evolutionary socialism does mean that you would ultimately get rid of capitalism, but just slowly through reform and
Mm.
democracy rather than through revolution. So there is a distinction. In a socialism essay, can I
Yeah.
write about Marx and Engels together? You can absolutely. You could suggest that Marx and Engels said in the Communist Manifesto that because they wrote it together. So feel free to
Mm.
bring them together. Um, yeah. Okay. So Marx and Engels are down not as separate thinkers. They are down as a thinker. But obviously, you can talk about something that Marx said
Yeah.
individually if he did say it individually and not with Engels.
And I
That's
think,
fine.
you know,
That's
the
fine.
examiner sees the word Marx, so the name Marx and the
That's
name
fine.
Engels, it counts as a key thinker. So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's fine.
so I think
Yeah,
it's important to do
yeah.
that, and you
I,
don't have to say and it doesn't.
Yeah. Actually, to be fair, I don't know the answer to this, but I wouldn't use Marx and Engels as your two thinkers. I'd
No, no,
avoid.
you go
Yeah, no, no.
one. Yeah,
So from that point of view, think of them as one. From the point of view of your making sure you've hit your two key thinkers, but in other respects, you can talk about
everyone
them.
always forgets Engels. Jesse said,
Oh, poor
"Oh,
Freddie
boy,
Engels.
yeah,
Um, shall we have another look at another quick activity while people are um, talking
yeah,
about these things? So now this one, I think it's asking for a fairly quick thing to
mm,
conservative thinkers that might talk about human nature, but obviously we want them to say a little bit about how they exemplify a conservative view on human nature. What
yeah."
do they say about human nature, don't we? So we need some follow-up stuff on this. Okay, here we go.
That's question eight, one. So
Okay, seeing some
read out
points come through.
April's one. She said, so she talked about Hobbes and that human nature is exemplified in his quote, nasty, brutish, and short, which describes the life of man and a human nature. Excellent. Arabella added to that, said Hobbes argues that you need a leviathan in order to take control over the selfish human nature. So good. The idea that the state should be all powerful. That's a nice link to the criteria of the state, right? That the state must be powerful because humans are so despicable. Russ's barbecue rib. Oh, I could see you again. Argue that Burke is a good one as well. So tradition guides humans towards rationality, despite human nature being flawed. So yeah, the only hope for humans is through traditional structures. Lovely.
Got lots
You
of
got
Rand there. Oh yeah,
Oh
sorry,
yeah,
Oakshott.
Rand, yeah, fulfillment and liberation. Yeah, because it's an interesting one because Rand, you're kind of almost close to a deviation of human nature, right? And within conservatives, because she's kind of like there's hope, there's rationality and potential with humans, but we're still selfish, right? So the human nature is still ultimately quite negative. That's a great one. Um, I like this one. Oakshott, humans are fragile and fallible. And yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, that's the opinion of Oakshott. So still that kind of negative
Yeah,
perception, sorry, of humans.
yeah. But I mean, from I'd say all of them are are less dramatically negative than Hobbes. Probably they all see slightly more.
Hobbes
Um,
is definitely well, he needed a hug.
yeah. Nozick, egotistical, quest of self ownership. Yeah, I mean it's interesting. Nozick is probably of all of them has the most positive view of human nature. If humans were left to their own devices rather than the state, essentially stopping us
Mm.
from pursuing our real nature. Um, because he's a liberal, really. But sorry, I shouldn't say that. Oh,
We'll
near an
get into
anarchist, really. Close,
it
close to an anarchist. Yeah, is he a
and then
neoliberal or a neoconservative? Nozick, I would say a neoliberal, really, and and that's an interesting thing. Most when we talk about the new right, obviously, there is the neoconservative element of the new right as well, which neither of our thinkers particularly exemplify. They're both, you know, good examples of neoliberals, but not really of neoconservatives. Could do with Thatcher or someone in there, really, couldn't you, to include a bit of
yeah,
traditional family values and all that kind of thing. But
yeah,
anyway,
and again, you can
you
mention
can,
that.
you
There's
can.
nothing wrong with it. Just make sure that you've got your bases covered with your two key thinkers, and that, like just like the conservative view of human nature, the specification isn't perfect. So
Yeah.
it's just about such a lame joke. Sorry, but about just trying
I
to
liked it. I appreciated it.
thank you,
Well
thank you. So yeah,
yeah,
it doesn't. They don't all fit perfectly, and that's why having the other thinkers you might have studied or you might know and including them is absolutely fine. Just make sure you've got your two key ones, so that you fit that quota, the requirement.
yeah. Um, I think maybe should we have a little break from ideas for a minute? 'Cause we've had quite a lot of questions about other
Mm.
stuff, and I don't want to feel that we've not covered any of it. We might come back to some ideas bits in a minute. This one's an interesting one. If a political party question asks about minor parties, can you
Mhm.
refer to Lib Dems as a minor party, although the spec says they are major? I, I think so. I think you need to be slightly cautious because they are listed as a major party. But if you're making a point, I think it just
Mm.
depends what the point you are illustrating is. So if you're illustrating a point that the Lib Dems is a good example to illustrate that point, for example, maybe them being underrepresented by first past the post, or that they can still have an influence on government policy despite, you know, unlikely to ever win a majority. So using the example of the coalition or something like that, I think that is absolutely fine. I suppose the interesting flip to that would be if you were asking a question about major parties, could you talk about the Lib Dems? And yeah, I assume yes, you could, even though it doesn't really
Mm.
make sense. And if I were you, I wouldn't. I guess there'd be more to say about Conservative or Labour, but in theory you could. So yeah, would you agree, Kira? It just depends what point you're making. If it
And
illustrates the point well, then that
Yeah, exactly. And they're not like looking to catch you out.
no.
So they're not gonna like there's nothing in the mark scheme specifically about saying Lib Dems are a major or minor party. It's in the spec, that's true, but not necessarily in the mark scheme.
No.
Whereas when we were talking about the ideologies and the strands and the thinkers, that is in the mark scheme. So that's where you have to be a bit more careful. But in terms of that, I think you've got scope there, and I think it's okay.
Yeah. So there were a few questions about Lib Dems being a major party, and I think hopefully that's sort of addressed all of them. I think. In a source question, is it okay for me to do 2 big paragraphs with 4 references to the sources, a point and counter, with analysis and evaluation for each big paragraph? I'm going to see what Ciara thinks first of
Oh,
all.
thank you. Yeah. Okay. All right. Um, so in terms of essay structure and how much you should write and things like that, there is no instruction from the exam
No,
board.
there
And I
isn't.
think what you're looking at as an examiner is you're not thinking, okay, here you go, 3 paragraphs, tick. Okay, 5 references to the source, tick. What you're actually looking for is it a comprehensive essay? You're not going to achieve that in 1 paragraph, for example. So you would probably need at least 2. And I don't know, for me, realistically, it's going to be hard to not only read a source, work out the arguments, and then to have like maybe half an hour left for your writing, to be writing loads of paragraphs. I wouldn't really expect that. What I would like to see when I'm marking things is, do you have your argument stemming from the source? Do you have evidence to support that analysis? Do you also have a counter argument from the source, evidence, analysis, and things like that? So that's what you're more so kind of looking for, isn't it? Rather than counting
Yeah,
paragraphs and lines and things like that.
yeah. I think that's a key thing. I know students always want to know how many paragraphs should I write, and I understand why that's an important question because you know could be 1, could be 150 or whatever, and I appreciate some guidance on that is useful. But what
Mm,
I would say is no one counts them. They may get an impression, oh, this feels a bit light, or oh, this is long, but they're not going to sit and count paragraphs. What they and the other thing is that your paragraph might be very different from someone else's paragraph, and so when we say, oh well, like say when we were just talking about ideas questions, then if you actually think about one half being agree and the other half being disagree, and then that's between maybe 3 strands. Here's how the 3 strands maybe agree compared about a particular theme. Here's how the 3 strands maybe disagree. That's 1 paragraph.
mm.
If that is 1 paragraph, then you're not going to do more than probably 2 of those because that's a lot. That's a big, that's a big bit of writing. But if your paragraph is a little slimmer than that, if you're generally writing a bit, covering a bit less ground than that in a paragraph, then you might need to write a bit more. So I think sometimes when we're giving numbers, that's kind of it's not necessarily entirely helpful because what you understand by 2 or 3 paragraphs might be different from what someone else understands by it. And is it including some nice comparative analysis explaining why you're reaching your mini judgment and all that kind of thing, because that's what
Yeah.
it should be doing. And if you're doing loads of that, then fewer meatier paragraphs may well be stronger and we get higher in the mark.
Yeah. And, Finlay asked, do you do counterpoints in a source question? And yeah, you do. So it's the same as a normal essay question. And remember, the AO3 is talking about the idea of balance, so considering both sides of the argument. AO2 is talking about comparison. So you're going to need something to compare. So you need to have that argument and that counter argument. So that's important. And with a source question, that has to come from the source. So the argument comes from the source, the counter argument comes from the source as well. Everything else you do on your own, but you get those 2 things from the source.
Okay. So we've got what's the best way to signpost the counterpoint evaluation? I know what you mean, like, however, or on the other hand, I think particularly with the sources, you can very much use the fact that you're getting this alternative argument from the source. That always works quite nicely. Make sure, I'm going to link to this one as well. Does the counter need to be linked to the main point, even if there aren't good links in the source? You need to try and find a link. There needs to be a reason why you're putting these 2 things together. Occasionally that might require you doing a little bit of lateral thinking or whatever, grouping them together in a theme or something
Mm.
like that. But yeah, you need to link them.
Yeah,
can you
it's a good question.
manipulate the source? Like if it mentions a term but on the opposing argument, can you manipulate it as just referencing the term without having to follow the same argument there? I know what you mean.
Yeah, and I think, do you know, when you're looking at the older source questions, especially the sample assessment material, I did feel like it was harder to find that counter argument,
Mm,
and that's why where you might be doing that kind of clever stuff that April's talking about, like, shoehorning it in and making it fit. But from what I've seen in the last few exam papers, I do think the counter and the argument are actually easier to identify, and I
mm,
think they've improved it in that sense. So I wouldn't stress about doing that so much. I feel like it's much easier to do now.
mm,
And that's that importance of just reading that source really carefully
yeah.
and like reading the question so you know what you're looking for, then reading the source and looking for the argument and the counter. And I always think it's good to do a mini table and put them down on a planning piece of paper in the exam paper, and then trying to connect them in that sense.
Okay. Source is the saviour we've got here. And I think that's a good point. There's so many questions where
Mm.
um, you have to come up with the arguments. You have to think about what the arguments are on each side. The source question, they give you them. And so, you know, you have to select them and you have to analyze them and give some examples and compare them, etc. But at least you've got the arguments. I've had lots of questions coming in here, which is good. Um, here we go. Any advice for when you see a question in the exam and you realise you don't have a plan or any idea what to write? I'm assuming this is one where there isn't a
Yeah.
choice, where, where you can't just do the other
Stand
question.
back.
Hopefully, for the most part, you can just
We've all
choose to
been
do the
there.
other question. But it can
Yeah.
happen. Hopefully, it
Mm.
won't happen. I mean, that's the big thing. You'll be well prepared. You've done loads of revision.
Yeah.
Um, take a breath, sit back, think they're only assessing things I know. I've spent 2 years learning this. They're not asking us something random that we haven't learned about. So I need to think about what this question's really asking. So take a step back and then you start to kind of decode the question and think, what out of what I've learned in the last couple of years is this question really trying to get at? And I think then you calm down and get yourself into it and just start thinking, well, I can do this actually. Come up with two or three criteria to judge the answer and think of stuff that you can bring in, and I think you'll be all right. Really,
And I think
try not to panic.
exactly, yeah, don't panic. And yeah, like you said, it's about calming down. And when we're thinking about the questions, we break it down. We go, okay, we have this many minutes to write this question. We divide the paper by three or by marks or whatever. And like, this is how much we have for each question. But actually, it's not about that's not time just to write. It's also time to think. And that is included in that time that you're allotted for each question. And I think sometimes we panic and we just rush into it and we go, I know political parties, I see that word's in the question, let me just quickly plan and answer that and I'm going to write it. But actually it's good to read all questions and, like Duncan said, decode it. Like, what is this question actually asking me? And then going from there. So going slower, not faster, which sounds a bit crazy, but it is actually the best thing to do. You get a better answer for that.
Yeah. How many examples in the non-source question per point should I use? Again, there's not a prescriptive amount.
Mhm.
If in some ways, there's no point using a couple of examples that don't demonstrate anything different. So if you've used an example that explains your point, you don't really need
Mm.
another example that's just the same,
Yeah.
unless doing so kind of demonstrates that it's a strong point. If you know what I mean, that you might want to do that to say that this happens a lot. That this thing I'm talking about isn't just this one off. It happens a lot. So here's another example of it doing. If that was part of your comparative analysis, for example, if there was a reason for doing it. But if you're teasing out changes or differences or whatever, then if you've got a few examples that illustrate that, do it. Go for it. Don't keep your knowledge secret.
And yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think it's important to see that each component is equally weighted. So AO1 is part, sorry,
Oh, Kira's breaking up a little bit there.
it's about me. Oh,
We've lost you a little bit. I hope you're coming back.
am I back?
I think you're back. I think you're back. I think
Am I
so.
back now? Okay,
Yeah.
sorry about that. I hope so. Yeah, so it's like it's not about a collection of examples, the essay. It's actually about what you do with those examples. So if you spend loads of time jotting down examples, then you're probably not spending a lot of time analyzing those examples. And that's where the marks are coming in from. The examples feed the analysis. So just making sure that the examples are being dealt with. You can sometimes have two examples that prove the same point, and then you can put them both down and explain how both of these examples prove that point, but just making sure you're quite focused in your answer.
Okay. There's loads and loads of questions. We haven't got a sort of infinite amount of time. Obviously, we've got sort of five or 10 minutes left, really. But I do want to try and make sure we've covered a range of things that people have asked. Is it okay to use synoptic links within the ideologies? There's no need to on the core ideologies. I don't think there's no expectation for you to make synoptic links, and there's a risk it would send you off on a tangent. So no, I'm not 100% sure what you mean, but if you're thinking, oh, can I link it to anarchism or link it to global politics or something? To be honest, I wouldn't. I'd focus on what you've been asked, even though you might have a really nice, even though it might demonstrate some really good understanding and stuff. It may well send you off on a bit of a tangent. Voting behaviour in the recent local elections. Did the recent local elections demonstrate anything interesting we could pick out for voting behaviour? If you got a voting behaviour essay, could we use the local elections that have just gone as an example to illustrate anything in particular? I think we probably could.
Yeah, and I think Hannah's made a good point that the exam questions were written a while ago, right? So the politics has changed since then, but the questions won't be hinged on a political event or something that
No.
happened. They can sometimes be inspired by them. Like I thought that question about individual responsibility was interesting because obviously that was coming up a lot in the news. Like, do people even resign anymore? But they will be things that you can use modern examples for, as well as examples that you would have studied in year 12. So it's not going to be focused on a recent event. Somebody also asked about could you predict a conservative defeat and like forecast because it's forecasted. You can mention the effect in the polling that's happened, obviously, to Conservatives in the recent few months, but you don't necessarily want to say this means they're going to lose because that's not really going to be answering the question. Your case study, your most recent case study for an election, will be 2019. If you want to
For
talk
general.
about for general elections, sorry. If you want to talk about obviously the Conservative hit in the polls, you can evidence that with the by-election defeat and the local election
Yeah.
defeats. That's probably a more useful thing if you're going to bring that in. So just making sure you're concrete on that.
Yeah. Actually, just bringing that back to that point, because there was a thing about if they asked about changes in political parties, which they could do in a political parties essay, the mark scheme, although it was written a while ago, is not going to, like, just reiterating what Ciara says, what is happening now is what you're being assessed on. Politics is always contemporary politics. So, don't try and second guess to think, oh well, the mark scheme was probably written while Jeremy Corbyn was still leader, so I'll pretend Keir Starmer hasn't happened or whatever. No, you're writing about now, okay, and so the mark scheme will never be so prescriptive as to say, as to to not be relevant to for current events not to be relevant. Okay, I'm gonna. I think we're going to finish in a minute because the people are starting to go anti-sociology in the chat window, and
That's where you're off to next. Yeah.
I'm about to do so. Yeah, a few minutes we'll be doing sociology, and I might share one of these comments to the sociology viewers to see what they think about the idea of it being BTEC
There's more
politics.
of them than us, so
Lots of people talking about things like, for example, the turnout in the London mayor and things like that. Absolutely, you can talk about all of that. Contemporary politics is the way to go. The more contemporary examples, the better. Everyone's answering the questions beautifully in the mark schemes, which is in the chat window, which is what we want to do. We had last couple of questions. What is pragmatism? I think there was a debate going on in the
yeah.
discussion, and so I'm sort of picking one out of it. But it is a good thing. I think it was when people talk about what you'd write about in relation to one nation conservatism. I think that was what was being discussed there. And there's this idea, link it particularly with Oakeshott, but others as well, that conservatism is pragmatic rather than dogmatic. And even the idea that it's not really an ideology at all comes into there. So what's a good definition of pragmatic? Do what works rather than...
Yeah, it's practical. It's tried and tested. We're not gonna, well, for them, they're saying they're not married to a particular idea, that because that's what being dogmatic is, isn't it? It's like, I believe that capitalism is evil, therefore I'm going to get rid of capitalism, and even if it proves to be reliable, I'm going to keep it. I'm going to keep my idea of getting rid of it. Whereas pragmatism is a bit more ebbing and flowing. Like, okay, this looks like it works, so I'm going to move towards that.
An example might be, let's say, in the 1950s when the Conservatives got back into power following the Labour government, the Attlee Labour government. You might have expected the Conservatives to start privatising things and get rid of the NHS and stuff, because they'd opposed most of those things in opposition. They'd been against a lot of that stuff on ideological grounds, but actually a lot of it was working at the time, and for whatever, people obviously have different political views about it since. But at the time, the pragmatic approach was actually, let's keep most of this. It's functioning, it's working. We're not wedded to private enterprise as an ideological belief. We like it, but it's not. As it happens, an NHS is a good thing to have, so let's keep it. That would be a pragmatic thing. It works. Yeah. Okay. Is an example of that. I think we're nearly done. I've got a thing here, and I don't know. There was one there saying, "Oh right," someone said, "How would I answer this question?" And then I wasn't sure. Oh, sorry, no, but it's about it's about a non-core idea. I don't want to bring that in today.
Not yet.
I'd love to help you with how to answer your multiculturalism question, but I don't want to necessarily do it for everybody today, because it's very likely that very few of you are doing multiculturalism. So it's feel free to get in touch, Duncan at tutortude.net, and that's where I can send you a few ideas. But no. How far can you go back with examples? This is my last one. How far can you go back with examples? It's a good question. What do you reckon?
Yeah, so there's Jesse actually mentioned as well that there's a lot of historical events mentioned on the spec, and we refer to this. So there is an emphasis on recent examples because, like Duncan said, it's a contemporary A level. It's about things that are happening now. But if we want to make a point about patterns and things like that, well, a pattern has to be established before now, right? If we're going to make a point that, I don't know, individual responsibility is changing and things like that. So you do want to have kind of some older examples. And I think the ones that are mentioned specifically in the spec.
Sorry to interrupt you. I'm just going to bring in my first sociology guest. They're not on camera. They're just in the background in the green room. But just just while we're finishing off, so they're not hanging on the telephone. Okay.
I think that's the thing that's important. It's like, you've got your case studies for the elections because that shows whether or not first past the post works, and it shows it from 97 because that's obviously the one that's in the spec, but it's because it is a great example of how first past the post delivers big governments or strong governments. So it's thinking about it in that sense, like if you're using a historic example, are you establishing a pattern, and then it fits? If it's just like you're just talking about the 1980s and Thatcherism and things like that in your essays, then you're probably not really addressing how that's important today.
Yeah, and that's across the board for all your compounds, apart from ideas where it's all old stuff, but pretty much. But so a lot of the examples in the textbooks are a while ago because they were written a while ago, and so you get a lot of Tony Blair era and maybe Barack Obama era type examples, and David Cameron type examples, and they're fine if they illustrate the point really well. I'd avoid things like even though you might be doing British history as your as a topic in your history, and you might have some really good examples, I'd avoid really old stuff unless it's really obvious why it's relevant and it's a really good point to make. If you're just thinking, oh well, I've just been doing about the Liberal government in 1906, so I'm going to talk about that, It's like
All those
it's
people are dead. So
yeah, it's unlikely to be very relevant to the question actually,
yeah.
unless depending on what the question is, but in almost every situation, I would say. Okay, that was it. Oh gosh, people really are debating about what's better, sociology or politics in the thing. Right.
They're all talking. Let's not divide and fight. Gosh.
Yeah, there's people are starting to come together now, so that's good. We're going to leave it there, but thanks very much for all of
Sloppy
your fantastic
point.
questions and answers and contributions to tonight. Thank you very much, Ciara. And that was great. I really enjoyed it. I think you will do brilliantly. You've got 6 more days, so don't stress, don't panic. Anything we've talked about today where you think, oh, maybe I need to have a bit more of a look at that. Got time to do so. Okay, that's great. Okay, thanks guys.
Cool.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Yeah,
Best
good
of luck.
luck.
We'll see you for compound 2 stuff next week.
Yes.
Okay. Bye. Bye.
Bye bye.